thanks very much for joining me while I present this paper from my PhD today. I'm Louise Tomkow and I'm an NIHR academic clinical lecturer at the University of Manchester and Salford Royal Foundation Trust. And I'm going to talk to you today about some data from my PhD, which I completed in 2019 at the HCRI. And this paper explores how middle-aged and older asylum applicants in the UK speak about health in relation to migratory experiences. It proposes biocredibility as a novel theoretical concept through which the narratives of those migrating to the UK to seek asylum can be analysed. Biocredibility provides a way of understanding the discursive proximity between the social, political and economic aspects of life and ill health. Theoretically, the work is rooted in a sort of Foucauldian perspective and shows the vilifying effects of immigration categorisation and the biopolitics of immigration categorisation in the UK. And the data that I present today will show how participants used stories about ill health to criticise the hostile environment in the UK. And in this way, they were able to make powerful statements of attribution and resist the unwanted ascription of the identity of inevitably impaired. And then the discussion will unpick the drivers and consequences of this narrative phenomenon. So I'm just going to start by giving you an overview of the hostile environment in the UK, of which many of you will be familiar, I'm sure. So although asylum seekers constitute around 5% of all migrants to the UK, so not that many at all, British political discourse has long focused on minimising the attraction of the UK to those considered not to have a genuine asylum claim. So restrictive welfare policies make life as uncomfortable as possible, and that's partly to discourage other people coming, but also to pacify people who accuse the government of being a light touch on or a soft touch on immigration. And in 2012, British Home Secretary at the time, Theresa May, built on this already parsimonious sort of approach by promising to decrease migration from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands. And she promised to do that by creating a really hostile environment for those that she classified, or that the Home Office classified, as irregular migrants. And this included those who had applied for asylum and had those claims refused. The Immigration Acts of 2014-2016 built on this and shifted the enactment of border controls practices from sort of central government to into the everyday state actors and everyday non-state actors. So these immigration policies criminalised banks, landlords, healthcare professionals who didn't ensure that the people that they were providing a service to were eligible for that service. So not only were they subject to fines, they were then subject to, you could be imprisoned for it, basically. So migrants' entitlement to welfare and healthcare has long been dependent on immigration status, but that became a more concrete line, if you like. And that sort of embedded a network of immigration controls and calcified that network of immigration controls in the UK public services and into the everyday. So these new hostile environment policies, so-called hostile environment policies, were quite readily adopted into an environment where populist xenophobic narratives constructed asylum seekers as sort of welfare treats and bogus refugees in popular discourse. But this governmental drive to decrease migration has led to questions about the UK Home Office's ability to delineate between those who've got a well-founded fear of persecution and those who haven't. So basically, do the Home Office get it right when refusing asylum claims or accepting asylum claims? And research shows that, surprise, surprise, no, they probably don't. So in 2016, initial asylum applications, almost 70% were refused first time round, so 68% in 2016. But when these refusals were appealed in appeals court, 42% of claimants were successful in their appeal. So even by the British court's measures, the Home Office is getting it wrong nearly half the time. 42% of the time. I should be careful to be very clear. So in contrast with other legal procedures, asylum applications often involve no witnesses and have little corroborating documentary evidence. So asylum decisions and outcome decisions rest on what the asylum applicant says and how they say it. And perceived lack of credibility of the applicant is a commonly cited justification for the refusal of asylum applications in the UK. And research suggests that the Home Office has a pervasively embedded institutional culture of disbelief. But the weight of the responsibility lies with the asylum applicant to prove their grounds for refugee status, and questioning asylum's credibility provides the Home Office caseworkers with an easy route to refuse asylum applications and meet governmental asylum targets. The result is an asylum system that is both subjective and inconsistent. Oh, how do I move the slide on? Sorry, oh yeah, great. So, the theoretical framework that I use for this work is that of one that takes its ideas from critical medical anthropology, and I'll go on to talk about where Foucault and Hassan come in later. But amongst the health literature that looks at the health of asylum seekers and refugees, there is recognition in places like Holland and Australia that exile environments, so post-migratory environments, determine health outcomes post-migration. But that seems to not quite have got to the UK yet. So in the UK literature, there's a few dominant tropes about this health as asylum seekers and refugees. The first is that a bit of a preoccupation with communicable disease. So the migrant is often constructed as a vector of disease, and this is pre-COVID. So who knows what will happen afterwards? And yes, you're right, this is a little bit out of date probably now, isn't it? But pre-COVID, the preoccupation with the migrant and the vector of disease is an ancient trope, isn't it? The second is a preoccupation with migrants' access to healthcare. I also work on this issue, but in the literature about access to healthcare, there is a tendency to frame migrants as misusing healthcare, either not seeking care when appropriate or maybe overusing healthcare, and that's obviously very problematic. And there's also a preoccupation in the literature with mental health, and this preoccupation with mental health often concentrates on pre-migration trauma and presents migrants as already necessarily damaged and as damaged goods when they arrived. So I think, and I argued in my thesis, that these inquiries can overlook how the social, political and economic conditions in the UK shape migrants' experiences of health and illness. So that's how I come at this. And as I said, I draw on critical medical anthropology in that I believe and understand knowledge about health and experiences about health and migration to be sort of situated within and determined by contemporary social, political and economic environments. So biocredibility, the concept that I'm going to talk about today, builds on the work of Didier Fassin, who in turn built on the work of Foucault. In his work on governmentality, Foucault describes the phenomenon of biopower as the tactics used by contemporary states to govern lives. And then from this, he developed the idea of biopolitics, which refers to the particular strategies that make lives knowable and therefore governable. And of relevance to this research is Foucault's assertion that biopolitical strategies exert power over lives through the process of distinction and division. So creating certain groups considered worthy of protection as refugees, and then certain who are excluded from services, refused asylum seekers, is a biopolitical practice. From that, Fassin uses the term biolegitimacy to describe how the body has emerged as a source of legitimacy in contemporary societies. And Fassin's biolegitimate subject is produced through policies that legislate for the recognition of diseases or other impairments as a way of obtaining rights or resources. So I'll give you an example. It took me about 6 months to get my head around this, so hopefully this example should help. So in France, there is a humanitarian illness clause that affords refugees legal status if they have a serious illness. So this is a seemingly compassionate policy, you know, if someone's unwell, then give them status. But it's been problematised by Hassan and also by Mariam Tickton, who criticises it as a way of forming the medicalisation of migrants' rights might form a particular nation and a particular humanity, where illness and impairment are the main bargaining chips for resources, and they question the effects of this. However, biolegitimacy and the policies of biolegitimacy that are described by Hassan are absent from the UK environment. So, as I said earlier, refugee status is given to asylum seekers who are able to credibly demonstrate their well-founded fear of persecution. Not illness doesn't really come into it. There are very few small clauses to that, but generally illness doesn't come into it in the UK. And to drive down migration and rationalise welfare in a climate of xenophobia and austerity, that same credibility in the UK is eroded. Here we embed borders into welfare and healthcare systems, and migrants' eligibility for those services are based on their immigration status rather than any sort of clinical need. So biocredibility is the novel concept that I'm going to present in this paper, and this was born out of my doctoral research project. The concept builds on Hassan's work, but it's got some important differences. So whereas Hassan's biolegitimacy, it describes a political culture, the biocredibility that I'm going to talk about today refers to and provides a way of understanding the way in which people use stories of illness to add credibility to their stories of lived experience. And I'm going to use the term pathography, which is an individual's autobiographical story of illness. And I'll also use the term narrative enclave, which is basically like a short section of distinct prose that's inserted into longer stories of lived experience. So the results section of this presentation will illustrate the 3 core tenets of biocredibility, and the discussion section will pick it apart a little bit and look at the drivers of this. So I'll talk about my methods that I use to collect my data. So I did 21 face-to-face, pre-COVID, semi-structured interviews with people who had applied for asylum in the UK. 16 were male, 5 were female. I was interested also in stories and experiences of ageing. So the ages ranged from 46 to 76 years old. And the countries of origin were quite varied, and the duration of time spent in the UK was from 20 years to 3 years. As you can see, participants had varied immigration statuses, and I used narrative analysis to understand the data. And narrative analysis encourages a focus on the meaning, structure and content of stories and the inferences that these components can make about broader social processes. As I said briefly before I started the presentation, I've changed the place names and pseudonyms, used pseudonyms to protect individuals' identities, and I've taken out ages and countries of origin just to further protect the participants. I know this is being recorded. So in terms of results, the most striking result was the degree to which the stories of harshness of life in the UK dominated the data. Participants were asked about their life and health in their countries of origin, in the migratory phase, as they migrated, and then post-migration. And the most striking finding was the degree to which they focused on life in the UK. Despite varied immigration statuses, participants focused on the time spent awaiting a decision from the Home Office. And this is whether it be during the initial asylum claim, even with people with secure status now, or more secure status now, or during an appeal. And so the next section of the presentation, I'm going to present around the 3 core features of this idea of biocredibility. And the first one is how participants communicate the cause of their illness. The second being how narratives stress the significance of particular experiences. And the third being how illness stories provide narrative evidence of autobiographical testimony. And we'll examine these in turn. So the majority of participants felt that their health was poor. Throughout the interviews, particular personal experiences of ill health were narrated around stories of social, political and economic strife in the UK. And this was done in a way that located the cause of illnesses in these social conditions. And this is the first feature of biocredibility. So I'll start by talking about Hassan, who was a refugee who fled his Syrian home in 2015 after war broke out, and he spoke about his life in Syria. He talked about a time of prosperity and achievement, and it was disrupted by conflict. And he travelled to the UK on a tourist visa to stay with his daughter, and then applied for asylum in the UK. To secure his immigration status, and he located the beginnings of his asylum application with a decline in his health. I'll let you read this because my mouth is getting dry. I'm just going to have some water. So Hassan uses a story about illness to describe the lived experiences he sees as significant, and as a result he draws attention to the harshness of life in the UK. He makes this explicit in both the content of the narrative, so what he says, and he says, because of what happened to me here, my health got affected, but he also allows it to be implied through the structure of the story. So although he suffered a stroke whilst he was in Syria, he articulates the symptoms of his weakness from his stroke in a way that associates them in time with his time in the UK. So specifically, he locates the change in his health with his accommodation difficulties, and he quantifies this numerically and describes a loss of cognitive function and capacity that underpinned his professional life. This interweaving of stories of health on the one hand and illness on the other, health and illness on the one hand and social and economical and political life on the other, emerged both in the content of the narrative, so in what was said, but also in the construction of the narrative, so how it was said. And this was observed across the sample, despite the multiple and varied life experiences and marginalizations that they faced. So many of the narratives, as you will see, construct the asylum system in the UK as harsh, and substandard accommodation and homelessness emerged as a material manifestation of that precarity. Following several refused asylum applications, Farhad, a 75-year-old chap, spent recent years living in destitution, often street homeless, and he described an eye infection. I'm going to the doctor, he said, I'm going to the doctor last year. My eyes was infection because I was living outside. I did not have a house or any benefits, and so my eye got an infection. And thanks to God and to the hospital, they helped me. So within this narrative about his eye infection, he constructs an enclave into which he inserts information about his social condition. Thus, he makes sense of his infection of his eye by interpreting it against his homelessness. Coupled with the use of repetition and emphasis, the result is the narrative that makes the cause of his ill health clear. Analysing this as a form of biocredibility shows how, by attributing his illness to his homelessness, he uses a description of a hospital visit to reproach social hardships. So therefore, he uses his illness as a way of engaging in socio-political critique. The second feature of biocredibility is the way in which illness stories allowed the participants to stress the significance of their lived experiences. Many of the stories that people told me focused on encounters with the Home Office, and particularly challenging seemed to be the asylum interview. So asylum interviews are used in order to collect information and make a decision about whether or not people have a well-founded fear of persecutions. The Home Office website says, you need to tell us how you were persecuted in your country and why you're afraid to go back to your country. And based on the responses to that, the Home Office caseworkers will then make a decision about whether or not the claim for asylum is credible. The participants that I spoke to likened this experience to an interrogation. I'll let you read those accounts there. Many of the participants also spoke about being disbelieved by the Home Office. So Tala, a Kuwaiti refugee, was trying to coordinate family reunification with her daughter, but she was disbelieved by the Home Office. And she told me that she was finding it difficult to prove that her daughter was biologically her daughter. And many of the participants would often insist, sort of unprompted, throughout the interviews, that the account that they were giving during the interview was honest. So Francis, a refused asylum seeker from Cameroon, stopped mid-story and asked, "Do you believe me?" Phrases such as "believe me" or "I'm telling the truth" or "I'm being honest with you" were sort of peppered regularly through the data. And Francis later told me about having his autobiographical testimony of torture disbelieved by the Home Office, and thus his asylum application refused, and he associated this with ill health. I'll let you have a read of that as well. So in this narrative, Francis constructs the Home Office as a threat to his well-being and ultimately his life. He uses stories of biological and cognitive dysfunction to relay the suffering caused by the Home Office. Aaron also describes the Home Office interviews like an interrogation. In this excerpt presented here, he intertwines his memories of his asylum interview with stories of anxiety and collapse, and this section illustrates many of the features of biocredibility. I'll let you read that. So in this, he clearly blames the interview for his anxiety, and the description of his biological dysfunction allows him to convey the gravity of his lived experience. So after stating that he's unable to describe how scared it made him, he then illustrates it by describing a faint. So elaborating on this through his assertion of previous good health further sort of crystallises the significance of that event, and in this way he emphasises his distress. So the third feature of biocredibility is how the body emerges as evidence, and how narratives of illness can provide evidence of autobiographical testimony. So by attributing causation and stressing the significance, these are two of the ways in which the body can be used as a form of evidence to corroborate autobiographies. So Ahmed, 52, is a refused asylum seeker who's lived in the UK for 10 years. He was quite jovial throughout the interview, although he's having a pretty tough time. He's had multiple Home Office refusals, and when I asked him to describe the appeals process, his tone changed and his demeanour changed. He said, "I can't properly talk about the Home Office. It makes me very angry. It makes my blood pressure go up. The Home Office can give you heart attacks. I don't like to talk about it." So he uses stories about heart attacks and biological dysfunction to illustrate the threat of the Home Office to his health and his life. He uses it to support his claim that the Home Office is an oppressive force. And it echoes Francis's earlier story that he can't concentrate on the Home Office, the asylum process, because of concerns for his health and by extension to his life. So at this point, I just want to jump in and say that it's difficult to deduce whether these statements are narrative devices aimed solely at sort of conveying brutality, or whether they are rememberings of literal physical experiences. So did Ahmed did his blood pressure actually go up, or is he saying that his blood pressure goes up as a narrative device? So the concept of biocredibility doesn't want to explore that. I'm not interested in the actual cause of these biological experiences. I'm not interested in triangulating them with quantitative biological measurements. Instead, I want to use the concept to draw attention to the way in which recounting these biological rememberings might sort of add credibility to testimony, why that happens and what that illustrates about the social context. So the accounts of bodily dysfunction corroborate experiential stories and convey the importance and urgency of the hostile and austere environment in which they're seen. So Aneni is a 54-year-old refused asylum seeker, and she initially came to the UK on a working visa and then applied for asylum. And like the others, she described difficulties of the asylum system and the Home Office interview, particularly pathologically and physically. I'll let you have a read of that. So this section of data illustrates all of the core features of biocredibility. So Aneni blames the Home Office for making her ill. The story of vaginal bleeding effectively conveys the significance of the event, and by telling of the bleeding, she provides narrative evidence of her experience. And as a result, this stark biological illustration adds credibility to her assertions of the harshness of life as an asylum seeker. So the data that I presented highlights the pervasive effects of policies and practices that question asylum applicants' credibility and integrity and create social and material vulnerabilities. Participants spoke about the threat posed by the hostile exile environment in relation to illness, and illness stories emerge as a narrative tool. They perform critiques of social, political, and economic life in the UK. Biocredibility both refers to and provides a way of understanding this. Rather than stories of illness taking centre stage, the stories of illness or pathographies are used to emphasise the social and material conditions of asylum and support descriptions of hostile encounters within the asylum apparatus. But clearly, more broadly, every individual who narrates any story of lived experience wants to create a story that sounds credible. So why is credibility so critical in this context? So in order to understand this, I think it's very important to recognise that the current hostile environment, social and political environment in the UK constructs migrants as untrustworthy. Research shows that asylum seekers must be excellent narrators of their own story in order to gain refugee status. And the asylum apparatus is increasingly diffuse, as I have described. So it embeds the sort of biopolitics of immigration categorisation into the everyday. So the question of credibility is highly consequential. So it follows that endeavours to sort of reclaim this credibility extend beyond the asylum interview and into the talk of everyday life and in this research encounter. It's important to state, I'm going to restate because I have done once before, that this research is unable to and is not trying to answer questions about whether the Home Office actually causes illness. So in biocredibility narratives, illness can appear as a narrative of experience, but also as a narrative device. And speculating that participants' readiness to draw on these illness stories is due to a sort of fraudulent or neurotic or hypochondriac character that neglects an interrogation of the social context that is required to understand these tendencies and why it occurs. Instead, biocredibility is rooted in the consideration of a narrative as a verbal action within a social context. And urges a critical consideration of the context in which it is observed. So what is it about this context that causes it then? So I've spoken about a number of dynamics which might produce biocredibility. So I've already spoken about the austere and hostile material and social conditions, which arguably leave asylum applicants with few other resources on which to draw when evidencing distress. I've spoken about the centrality of credibility. But I also suggest that this might be due to the social and political gazes that asylum applicants are subject to. So these objectifying gazes are polarised. So on the one hand, populist, hostile, anti-immigration sentiment naturalises this figure of the bogus asylum seeker as a threat to society. And on the other, asylum applicants are subject to a philanthropic humanitarian gaze, which constructs them as diseased or damaged and dependent and impaired. And both of these gazes and this whole research context is set against a dominant culture of medicalisation. And this was pre-COVID, so I'm assuming, I think there's interesting work to be done now, but I think the culture of medicalisation is probably expanding rather than anything. And this might produce or at least enhance stories of bodying failure. And the content and structure of participant narratives represents them as damaged as a direct result of the UK asylum system. And in this way, biocredibility allows them to sort of define themselves in opposition of the Home Office and condemn the conditions that they're experiencing in exile in a biomedically legitimate way. So in this way, they can oppose the Home Office, oppose that sort of position themselves in opposition to the Home Office, but also they can use it to let me think about how to articulate this properly. So the humanitarian gazes that construct asylum seekers as already and necessarily damaged and dependent by articulating the cause of the illness as avoidable and because of an ongoing social and political threat, biocredibility allows asylum applicants to reject the assumption that they are already damaged and say that this is actually avoidable. So in that way, it allows people to make a moral sort of decree of their treatment in exile. And I argue in my thesis that this can allow asylum applicants to sort of subvert their illness experiences and thus allow them to embark on a social and political critique. So what are the implications for the data and for the concept? So I hope that it makes a theoretical contribution to thinking about medicalisation, bordering and credibility. Empirically, the data highlights problems with immigration policy. I hope that the concept could be used to help encourage healthcare professionals to consider the broader structural determinants of health and drivers of suffering in a way that might encourage people to be activists or advocates or activists. I think there's more work needed to explore biocredibility in different contexts in the wake of COVID-19 and in the resultant insecure economic environment. Cuts will likely ensue to welfare and healthcare, and questions about biocredibility might extend beyond the sphere of migration into the nation state and into the entitlement of citizens. And it would be interesting to see how stories of biological dysfunction perform here as a form of resistance and as a demonstration of deservingness. So in conclusion, this paper has presented, illustrated and critically analysed a novel theoretical concept. Born out of the narrative analysis of asylum applicant stories of life and health, biocredibility provides a way of understanding the discursive proximity between social, economic and political life and illness and health. I've spoken about the drivers of this and the consequences of it, but most importantly, I think the biocredibility should be understood to highlight the cause of asylum applicants' distress. And these research findings therefore identify a need for considerate reform of asylum policy in the UK, and the reform should be attentive to the ways in which vulnerability and suffering is produced and to the social and material conditions of asylum. Thanks very much.